מאוד. Okay. Shalom, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon for those in North America, and good evening for those in Israel and around the world. And in Australia, good morning. It's really an incredible opportunity to come together, the entire world, and learn together. And as the Rabbanit Hankin spoke about in the previous session, be able to deal with the most difficult questions and the most difficult situations that our community faces and individuals in our community face. And it's really, I think, once we heard that, we're entering into the next session and right into the eye of the storm. And I think that we're going to be dealing with some of the most difficult and sensitive topics today's session. And the reason why is because we have a responsibility as a community to do so. And we've invited three panelists, three very, very special panelists, unique panelists, to share with us their experience dealing with these issues. And I think that it takes a very special person to make a decision to focus their life on helping people where they need it most. And before we even get into what Dr. Pelkovitz, Rabbi Rees, and Keshet Star are going to tell us, I think that the entire community owes them a tremendous appreciation for the work that they do, for the Mesiras Nefesh that they do, for the constant care that they give to so many individuals, and it's 99% behind the scenes. And only the people that have been touched by their work actually know what they have done. And those are the heroes of our community, and we really want to thank them for everything they do, and we want to mechazik them in their shlichut and their avodat Hashem, and continue for many, 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 many years. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi Mazer. And I just want to add, as Yoatzot Halacha, we have not shied away from the very, very difficult topics that we address in healthy marriages and trying to strengthen healthy marriages. And it's tough. I know how draining it is personally. We carry people's stories, and here we have people who you spend your days dealing with the unhealthy marriages, and that is really tremendous, and I don't take that for granted for a minute. So in light of that, we took on a heavy topic here. We want to talk about domestic abuse, and we want to understand the intersection of domestic abuse and get refusal. And that is why we have these esteemed panelists with us. So I think to open up the discussion, I'd like to turn to Dr. Pelkovitz first, if that's okay. And Dr. Pelkovitz, if you could kind of just give us a little details, really, before we talk about the get refusal. Kind of situate us in the right place in terms of understanding domestic abuse.
Yeah, it's very hard to understand because I think there's a natural kind of instinct to deny, and to say this is a problem that happens in other communities, it doesn't happen in ours. And one of the biggest challenges is to recognize that anything that happens in the general community can happen in ours as well, in spite of all the protective factors. So, thanks to the amazing work by my colleagues on this call, there's the level of care, the level of intervention has tremendously improved, but we have a long way to go.
Okay, so now that you correctly let us understand just that we can't assume that we are immune to the issues from the outside world, so we have a particular way in which abuse rears its ugly head, although perhaps you could speak to the fact that that is not right? The get refusal is more complex than that, but can we start from the perspective, Dr. Pelkovitz, if you could explain to us what that connection between domestic abuse and get refusal is?
Yeah, so ORA has actually there are a few organizations, ORA and then Yashar, have been involved in actually some empirical research, but also intervention in terms of trying to understand that connection. So we actually have all kinds of important information on based on some actually clinical and research studies that we've done, looking at what are some of the psychological impact of of being exposed to get refusal. What's the impact on the children? And over the last few years, especially under the leadership of Keshet and of the incredible staff there, especially Rabbi Hefter, we've been able to and with the support of the Ashar Coalition, we've been able to have some really solid empirical data, I think, showing us what the impact is in terms of level of post-traumatic stress disorder, what it looks like in terms of looking much more severe than I initially expected. When I went into that, looking at it empirically, I wasn't expecting, I sort of, I guess, had a prejudice to not see it as being as severe as, the 25 years or so that I worked with women living in a domestic violence shelter in the general community. And I was kind of shocked to see that there was a whole range of pretty serious abuse, pretty serious impact in women who were agunot, including sexual coercion, including high rates of suicidality, high rates of really serious domestic violence. It was sort of horrifying to see the results as they came out of the computer as we analyzed it. And thanks to the amazing work of Keshet and Rabbi Hefter, we have some answers that we never had before. So hopefully that's one of the things we could discuss.
Before we get into the conversation regarding how to deal with the process of freeing a woman from a get refusal, which we'll get to in a moment, is there anything that the community, this is another question for Dr. Pelkovitz, is there anything that the community can be doing to support the women and the families and the children in this situation, other than just the advocacy that they can possibly help in order to accomplish kind of the end goal? Sometimes when we're trying to accomplish some sort of end goal, we forget the process itself. Is there anything the community can be doing better to support the women and children during that process itself?
Yeah, look, that question I think I'd like to give to Keshe, because she spent years working on that. So I'll send it right over to you, Keshe. But yeah, just believing people, being there, being involved in terms of facilitating prenups, rabbinic training, but mostly letting people know, letting these women know they're not alone. That's no small thing. That we're at their side, that we're there, and that we want to be there any way we can in terms of offering emotional support. But Keshe, you're the one who's done some amazing work in terms of education and prevention. Can you share some of that with us?
Sure. And really, there are so many things that communities can do to be involved. We can talk a little more about the halachic prenup, halachic postnup later on, but that's a great area for communities to really get involved, make a change, and really send a message that we don't condone get refusal here. But I think as well, just knowing that there are resources out there, that there are people waiting to help, believing women when they come to ask for help, And I think in some ways, it's really just about overcoming that discomfort we can have when there's just a situation that's awkward. You know, divorces are uncomfortable and contentious divorces are extra uncomfortable. And it can be tempting sometimes to just invite someone else for Shabbos and sort of save yourself the stress. But I think that our communities can do such an amazing job in being support systems when we are ready to overcome that initial discomfort to do that. So just thinking about how much strength we can offer people who are struggling and how much support and validation we can offer when we're willing to be brave enough to do that.
Can you give us, now that we've moved over to Keshet, would you be able to take a step back and just give us a little bit of a sense of the work that Aura does in the community? What's the mission of Aura? What are the areas in which it touches the community and affects the community? Would you be able to just give us a little bit of a background?
Absolutely. So our goal at Aura is to take abuse out of the Jewish divorce process. That's sort of the very broad goal. And we do that by offering interventions at different stages along the process. So chances are, if you've heard about Aura, you know that we do advocacy work, and that is a big part of our work. We have a team that works with Aguno, really tries to listen to their needs and create tailored strategies that are honestly different for every case because these are complex situations. We also run a Jewish divorce helpline. We encourage people to call early on. Part of what makes this issue so difficult is that it's so confusing. What do I do first? And how does court work? And how does Beis Din work? And how do they work together? So we really help to demystify that process and connect people with appropriate resources. And then in addition, we want to educate the community about get refusal, about how get refusal is a form of domestic abuse, and about how you can be part of making a change in signing a halachic prenup or halachic postnup. So we go into high schools, we run a program for college students, we go into shuls and do scholars in residence, we speak to attorneys, rabbis, basically anyone who's willing to speak with us to really try and spread that message and make sure that, especially when we're talking to students, that it's an encouraging, empowering message and not something scary, but something that prepares them to be able to be part of creating a change on this issue. And the last thing I'll say is that we help people sign prenups. And so if anyone is just confused, well, which version of the prenup do I sign? Or I'm not sure where I'm going to live, and there are different versions for different jurisdictions. We'll just help talk couples through that process. Again, connect them with the right resources and answer their questions. So because we love the prenup, we want to make it really easy and painless and free to sign. So that's part of our work as well.
How would you so thank you for that synopsis. It's really, sometimes all organizations in our community are like icebergs where we only see the tip. We only see the most public sphere, and it's, I think, really, really important that we support our local and community organizations, because without them, especially in the times that we've been experiencing, without them, we're really lost. And thank you for sharing with us the rest of that iceberg. Maybe this is a question both for Keshet as well as Rabbi Rees. How do generally agunot or get refusal cases begin? Meaning, is it generally something you can spot right at the beginning of the gerushin process and divorce process? Is it something that develops over time just because the gerushin itself is not being meaning handled either by both sides, by external voices in the wrong way? How do those get refusal cases begin? And how can we maybe mitigate them or notice them from the beginning?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a thought-provoking question, because we don't, necessarily from the standpoint of the Beit Din, where we adjudicate cases and we preside over Jewish divorces, we don't necessarily classify a case from day one as a get refusal case. A case becomes a get refusal case when we reach out, for example, to the husband, and after we have served the husband with a series of summonses, usually 3 summons, and he doesn't respond with a spirit of cooperation towards the Besdin, so then we recognize that we're dealing with somebody who's recalcitrant, and we have to issue a kasav seruv, an order of recalcitrance that would then spark Ora, for example, to go into action because they would serve as the enforcement arm, so to speak, for the decrees of the Besdin, determining that a person was recalcitrant. So from a technical perspective, it's only after we've reached out to somebody when a divorce get case has been filed at the Besdin, and we see that there is a lack of cooperation, that it suddenly becomes a get refusal case, either because the Besdin has ordered that a get should be given after meeting with the parties and the husband doesn't cooperate, or because the husband refuses to cooperate with even showing up to the Besdin for an adjudication of the get issue in the first place. But the reality is that you can really pretty much predict from day one when there is a greater likelihood that a case is going to become a get refusal case, because there's a heightened sense of nervousness and anxiety coming from the wife when she approaches the Besdin, or maybe the husband will initially make the opening salvo and reaching out to the Besdin and making it clear that he intends to hold his wife hostage in terms of not giving a get until he gets everything that he wants and demands, so that the Besdin already knows ahead of time that it's dealing with an anxiety-ridden situation or a hostile and antagonistic situation. Now, of course, a get refusal, just for the sake of full disclosure, could go both ways. Sometimes it could be the wife who is the recalcitrant one and is refusing to accept the get. And I'm told that in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, that happens more frequently than it happens over here. But my general experience, I would suspect that Ora's general experience as well, is that in the vast majority of problematic cases, it is in fact the husband who is the recalcitrant party, and that's why we generally focus on that scenario. But just to make it clear, of course, the scenario could go both ways. So there is generally, so to speak, something in the air at the very outset that alerts us to the fact that we better be cautious and careful in order to do everything in our power to avoid an aguna situation.
Just before Keshet takes over that question, I just want to add on one extra point, which is that is it helpful to catch it early? Meaning, is it helpful if you notice that even before the process even starts, and a woman who's thinking about a divorce, but is very worried based upon the circumstances that it will end up entering into a get refusal case, is there anything that can be done early on, or that Ora can do, or maybe Dr. Pelkovitz can also take this question? Is there anything that can be done early on that could help mitigate? So similar question, but just a little bit of a different spin.
I'll give a brief response, and then Keshet and Dr. Pelkovitz can add to it. But the earliest that you intervene, the better. And when the best early intervention, of course, is to have the parties, sign a prenuptial agreement before they get married in the first place, so that in the event that there will be a problem, there already is a cure and a remedy that is in place, because really in virtually 100% of the cases where a proper halakhic prenuptial agreement has been executed, a get has been given in a timely fashion. So that's the best early intervention. That's early intervention before you even, have strife in the marriage, and that's an early intervention that every single couple can perform, both for themselves as an example for others at the time at which they get married. But even if a prenuptial agreement hasn't been signed, when the Besdin identifies, when the rabbis are involved, identify that this is a problematic case, so then they can galvanize the community, already have the appropriate conversations, with the relevant parties, put the necessary mechanisms in place, so that if things proceed in an unfavorable direction, all of the forces will be at play in terms of finding the right Besdin, to be involved in the process that you know that you can trust, to issue the proper documentation and to act upon that documentation, and to make sure that you have the other communal organizations ready to act when it's appropriate, in order to put the appropriate pressure on the recalcitrant husband, as is often the case, to persuade him to do the right thing.
See, I would think that if only the man in the situation we're talking about knew the incredible pain and knew the damage that could be done, forgetting everything else, the damage that could be done to their children, the damage could be done in terms of really serious kinds of damage to their spiritual development, damage to their emotional development. I think if they knew it early on, before they've dug in their heels and before it's gotten into this whole downward spiral, I would hope that they would be a little less likely to pull the trigger in terms of digging in for a prolonged kind of a fight. There's research that shows that the more intense the resistance on the part of both parties, and the more the legal fighting, the more likely there is a pretty decent chance that the children are going to end up not having a close relationship with the parent who's refusing to in any way listen. And I thought if they knew it early on, I would hope to think that maybe it could be nipped in the bud. I don't know. Do you see that at all, Keshet, in your work?
Sometimes, actually. And one of the interesting aspects of our work is that we speak to get refusers. We speak to agunot, we speak to get refusers as well. As Rabbi Reese mentioned, sometimes the get refuser is, the wife in the situation. That's rare for us, but it has happened. And very often the pitch I will make to get refusers is that this actually isn't going to help you in the end. Because what get refusal does is it really escalates the cycle of aggression in the divorce. And so one person isn't cooperating with the get, and the other person empties the bank account, and then someone withholds the children, and it sort of spirals out of control from there. And the more antagonistic the divorce is, the more regimented the custody arrangements have to be, and really the less flexibility each parent has in moving on with their lives and building a relationship with their children. So sometimes that argument works. We always try approaching people amicably first, and sometimes it gets the job done and sometimes it doesn't, and we do have to move towards other advocacy measures. But sometimes having that intervention really makes a difference. And I'll say as well, this is an area where family and friends can have a huge impact. That sometimes family and friends think that they're supporting the get refuser by encouraging them or validating their actions, and really the get refuser blows up their own life as much as everyone else's. So for family and friends, the more they can encourage the get refuser to move past the conflict, to plan for the future and the next chapter of their lives, it really makes outcomes better for everyone, and especially the children who have the least voice in all of these proceedings. So I think that's huge. And I'll say in terms of the early piece, really, again, the earlier the better. Because if everyone's going to behave nicely, then okay, you don't go to the perfect bait-in, or you don't structure the process in the ideal way. It's not so critical. But if you're dealing with someone that is going to try and manipulate the system, then you really need to be very thoughtful about going to a responsible bait-in that's going to move the case forward, and that's going to be a sensitive environment so that it's not an experience that's causing additional trauma. So I think getting that advice early on is absolutely fundamental. And you can often spot, as Rabbi Reese said, which cases are going to be difficult. We don't know 100%, but if there's a history of domestic abuse, if the get, for example, has been threatened in the marriage, you can leave me, but I'm never going to give you a get, so don't bother. If that kind of history is there, we can all guess that this is not going to be easy, and we can all really support the strategy of the case so that we hopefully get this done early, because the longer it goes, the more people get entrenched in their positions, the less open they are to thinking about things in a different way, and the harder it is to really get to a resolution.
So what you're mentioning is really leading me to really wonder, kind of getting into the psychology behind the get refuser, like trying to understand at what, I don't know, is there a tipping point? You know, is there a point at which we can really, you know, and also part of what I'm hearing is giving women, again, if most cases are women, giving them the tools and the ability to reach out and to kind of bring down the shame, because it sounds like if they get in earlier, then the chances of things not escalating, they may have more tools in order to work with the psychology. So I'd like to ask Dr. Pelkovitz to perhaps reflect on the psychology, that's what's going on in his mind, and how does that inform the way in which we help them come to a resolution?
Okay, so it's often about control. It's often about hurt. I mean, there's so many contributing factors. You know, there are many pathways to get to this, but it's I think if you get it early enough, you might be able to get it before it's really escalated completely out of control. These men they're emotionally withdrawing from, you know, a woman who they once loved, to who they once were incredibly connected to, and it's not an easy process. And they may have a personality that might be more compulsive, that might be more controlling. But the bottom line is that I think that if the real place, I think, to look at for prevention is in the community. Like I've seen, we had a keshet come to our community and do some training for the people in the community, just some psychoeducation about the role that the community could take, about understanding the dynamics, understanding ways of being helpful. And I think that it immediately made a difference, you know, because people started to see that there might be a role for them, and that it's not as simple and as all or nothing as they might have originally thought. If you get it that early, you know, in terms of the leadership of the community, helping people understand it very early on, I think there might be able to be a significant kind of lessening of the horrible kinds of outcomes. I'm reminded of the work of Dr. Emery, who's done this really important work showing that once this keeps going and it goes on the downward trajectory, you could almost guarantee, it's almost like an algorithm, that at the end of the day, there's gonna end up being a loss on the part of the usually it's going to be the father in this case, of an ongoing relationship with their child. I don't think anybody wants that early on, or very few people would want that, you know. So
yeah.
I'm wondering if we could switch tracks a little bit over to the halachic side, and Rabbi Reese, if Rabbi Reese could share with us some of the halachic aspects that are considered in aguna advocacy and in trying to get a proper get for this woman.
Absolutely. Look, one of the fundamental principles of the get process is that the get has to be given by the husband, delivered to the wife. If a get is coerced from the husband, then it's an invalid get, as a general rule. And therefore, one has to be extremely careful to bring about a get in such a fashion that it will be delivered voluntarily. by the husband, and will not be a get meusa, will not be a coerced get. There was a situation here in America several years ago where there were rabbis who were arrested for beating up a husband to give his wife a get. And besides the fact that, it wasn't a good idea, certainly from the perspective of Dina de Malchusa, the law of the land, it wasn't such a good idea from the perspective of halacha either, because usually if you beat up a man, it's not going to lead to a valid get. There are some cases that the Gemara discusses where physical coercion is permitted, or other forms of coercion are permitted, but those cases are very few and far between. So one of the important jobs is to figure out what type of a pressure is considered to be appropriate according to halacha. Very often, well-meaning members of the community don't necessarily know exactly where to draw the line. That's why one of the great things about Ora is that when it was developed really with two principles in mind. One, that they would be guided by halachic expertise, that there would be a rabbinic posek that would guide them in terms of making sure that their actions would only lead to a valid get. And number two, that they would be also guided by legal experts in terms of making sure that their efforts do not go beyond the bounds of what is legally permitted. And this has, led to the best possible, partnership between the halakhic authorities, between the Batei Din on the one hand, and the advocacy, which is promoted by Ora. It really fits into the model that the halacha very much emphasizes, really through a pasuk in the Torah, Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol she'arecha. You have to have the shoftim, the judges, and you have to have the shotrim, you have to have the enforcement mechanism. But first there has to be a due process of a Beis Din determining that this is a type of case where a get needs to be given. And number two, that the husband is acting in such a recalcitrant way that it's appropriate to take certain measures against him. One of the best ways of framing the types of measures that are generally viewed as acceptable was the distinction drawn by Rabbeinu Tam around 900 years ago or so, when Rabbeinu Tam said that if you're going to impose penalties upon somebody or restrict their freedom, then that will generally lead to a coerced get, which is problematic. But if you simply withhold benefits from a person, so then that does not lead to a coerced get. So if people decide we're not going to give membership privileges in a shul to a certain individual, we're not going to honor the individual, we're not going to invite the person to our weddings or bar mitzvahs, the person can't get an aliyah, things of that variety, we're not going to patronize the person's business. These are measures that are very often permissible and appropriate according to halacha. Even the protest rallies that are conducted by Ora when necessary also are basically declarations saying we don't consider you to be a member in good standing of the community until you cooperate with the get process appropriately with the Beis Din according to halacha. So it's withholding the benefit of being a person in good standing in the community until the person acts properly and submits themselves to the Beis Din process. But it's very important to understand that in order to combat injustice, it has to be done with a proper justice system. That's what the Beis Din is all about, in order to ensure that everybody have due process. But when it has been determined that a husband is recalcitrant, that the appropriate measures be taken in coordination with the Beis Din, so that a proper halakhic get can be given and will be given, so that the wife will be able to move on with her life as appropriate.
And I'll just add to that very briefly as well. That was so well said, Rabbi Reese. That also there's a lot of strategy involved in making a case public, in that very often we find that the best opportunity we have to work with the get refuser is the night before the rally, not the night afterwards, because it's the anticipation. It's like when you take your kid to the doctor and they know they're getting, immunizations. It's the anticipation of something coming that really creates the most stress and and can actually lead to the most movement. So we really try to, as we implement the tools that we do have in our toolbox that fit the halachic and legal requirements, that we're implementing them in sort of an escalating way so that we're able to really maximize the opportunity to get the person to work with us. Because if we just radicalize and alienate the person, then they're 10 times harder for us to work with, and we still need to get from them. So there's sort of a push-pull in trying to engage the person, but also show them that, hey, there is a siruv against you from a beast, and you're not going to be able to live your life as if you were not doing this thing. That we're going to set things up so that you can't just, carry along business as usual while you're involved in this injustice and while you're refusing to cooperate with the halachic process. So it really needs to be both, and that makes it complicated, but it can also be very effective because we are this close, tight-knit community. And when we use that to our advantage, it can really motivate people to say, you know what, maybe this has gotten out of hand, or it's just not worth it. I want to get invited out for Shabbos meals. I don't want to have to cook myself every Friday. Whatever the motivation is, when we use the strength of our community to encourage people to behave properly, it can be enormously effective.
Just want to follow up on what Keshe is describing as kind of the strategy behind going public. And very often for the community, meaning when things go public, we always hear the stats, and we always hear these what seems to be an extreme case where it's been refusal for 3, 2, 5 years, and that's kind of when things get out of hand and all of a sudden it becomes public. And I'm sure that all cases take that long to go public, but the question I think Keshe has alluded to is, when strategically should we be taking these cases public? And I was wondering, both from Dr. Pelkowitz as well as Rabbi Reese, when psychologically is that the right move, and when is it not the right move for the family, for the children involved, when sometimes there's a certain point where you say the benefits outweigh the risks, but how do we balance that question?
Yeah, listen, I agree completely with what Keshe is saying, that the time is before, not after, because after it's almost guaranteed to bring on resistance and opposition. Something I see often, though, is it's almost like you could see the process sometimes in Beis Din, when there's a child custody hearing, where there's an issue as to whether or not this husband's going to agree to give a get. Not a case that's already a case of him being ma'agin her for a while, but where there's a risk, and even the Beis Din is worried that it's going to happen. You could see an educational process working when the dayanim approach it's usually the man in a gentle kind of way to help educate him. And at that point, very often I've seen, Rabbi Reese, you obviously, this is your life very often, is these kind of situations. But I've been sitting on the Beis Din and with the Beis Din of America when whenever there are custody disputes for many years, and it's at that point that I see that there's probably a very high success rate before the man becomes truly recalcitrant. I at least it's impressionistic. Rabbi Reese, do you see that often, or?
Yeah, definitely. I also see that there's a value in taking care of the get at the beginning of a proceeding when we do have a case in front of the Beis Din, rather than waiting until the end. This was something that was advocated by Yosef Eliyahu Henkin going back over 50 years ago, when he said that he advocates that the get be given as early as possible in the process, because when things continue to be litigated, they often become much more acrimonious, and then it becomes much more difficult to take care of the get later on. But it's very important from the Beis Din perspective to make it clear that we are not engaged in advocacy for either side per se, meaning we are objectively adjudicating the case, whatever the claims happen to be with respect to child custody, with respect to the monetary issues and child support and so forth. However, I always carve out of that general statement that we do advocate one thing, and that is that there has to be a get, that nobody is allowed to withhold the get from the other person. They say that's not advocating on behalf of one particular side. That's advocating on behalf of the get. There's going to be a divorce, there has to be a get. And we always, make that distinction very clear so that the husband doesn't feel that we have it in for him. We don't have it in for him. We have nothing against him in terms of all of his other claims. He might prevail on the claims or prevail on many of the claims. However, regardless of how meritorious a person's claims might be, nobody has the right to use the get as a weapon. Nobody has the right to use the get as a leverage, as a bargaining chip. The get has to be given, period, whenever it's clear that a couple is getting divorced. And that's something that we try to make very clear, and we do it in a gentle fashion, in a non-adversarial fashion. I think that does make a huge difference.
I think just to follow up with one last discussion, I think that much of what the public is trying to understand is what is the community's role in all of this. Once a get refusal has gone to the worst case scenario, we weren't able to mitigate it, it went through all the processes, and then the decision was to make it public, and now it's within the public sphere. So obviously that becomes a partnership at that point between those who have been dealing with the get up until it reached that end, and now the public's now involved. So what do you expect from the public to do with the newfound information of this get refusal, and what are maybe even what not to do could be even more important to this discussion?
The best person to answer this question is Keshet, because she's really in the trenches in terms of galvanizing the community. But I'll simply mention that, the mitzvah of establishing Batei Din and effective mechanisms to enable the Batei Din to carry out their work, including to ensure that when there is a divorce, a get is given, that mitzvah is incumbent upon the community. That's a communal obligation. And therefore, whenever the Beis Din makes a determination that there's a recalcitrant party, so it becomes part of that communal obligation to ensure that everybody takes part in the enforcement of the Beis Din decision, that pressure needs to be brought to bear upon this husband so that a get be given in a timely fashion as quickly as possible. And then the only question becomes, how do you galvanize the community to act upon that obligation in order to serve as this, enforcement arm of the Beis Din, which is part of their communal responsibility? And, I'll leave that to Keshet to explain exactly, how that plays out.
Absolutely. Well, I was going to ask if I could start with what not to do and then go from there to the what to do. But I guess this is both a do and don't do, which is just as we do at ORA, it's really important for anyone involved in advocacy on a case to follow the law and to follow halacha. We see comments on social media, oh, let me go to this guy's house with a baseball bat. It's not funny. It's not cute. I've been called by law enforcement on multiple cases because really enthusiastic community members are making death threats, and it can undermine the advocacy of the entire case. It puts the aguna in a terrible position. Again, it's not funny. It's not clever. Don't do it. We have to represent ourselves well as a community and as advocates, that we follow the law, that there are many, many opportunities within the law to create change and to stand up for what's right. And that's what we're looking to do. And similarly, on the halachic front, if we're doing things that are halachically problematic, it also doesn't help the end result, and it doesn't ultimately help the aguna. So if you're getting in the advocacy space, stay within the boundaries of the law and halacha. I will tell you straight out, it can take some creativity to find solutions that address a complex case that fit within those boundaries. But that's why we have a lot of smart people working on this issue. And that's why we have a lot of smart people in our community who can have great ideas. But there really needs to be an awareness of where those boundaries are and where not to go. And the next thing I'll say, and this is a really important part of any time we're working with people who have experienced trauma and abuse, which is to really center the aguna's voice as much as possible. That I've had many conversations over the years where someone will say, oh, I want to have a rally. The aguna doesn't want it. How about we just have a rally and not tell her? Which is not how the internet works. But it's also really problematic because if there's a pushback from that rally, she's the one that's going to experience it. And if she's not ready, or it's not a good week or month or year for her to go down that road, we have to respect that. And I always feel that the hardest thing I have to do sometimes at ORA is sit on my hands when I really badly want to do something, but the aguna is saying not right now. And so to really have that sort of trauma-informed approach that we're not pushing people into things that they might not be ready for when it's their life, and that we recognize that it's their life and their decision. And I would say the next two pieces to keep in mind, if I cannot get away with four, which is, first of all, to also keep it simple. That what can sometimes happen if we have a get refuser that we know that we're trying to talk with, there's often this dynamic where the get refuser will make it really, really complicated and want you to read, 3 feet of litigation documents, and you can't say anything unless you know everything that's happened. And this is why, again, we have batei din that are involved that have made decisions that you can just say, there is a seira from this beis din saying that you're not cooperating with the get, you have to give a get because the marriage is over, and I don't need to make it any more complicated than that. So to really resist the urge that the get refuser will often have to just muddy the waters and make things super complicated. And then the final thing I'll say is that it's so easy to get fired up about an aguna case and then just move on and forget it. But every time we experience igun firsthand, that should be our alarm bell to do prevention work, because there is nothing more successful and more effective in the long term than having systems to prevent these cases to begin with. So when you see a case, let that be the fuel under the rocket to really think about what prevention systems are available in your community and what you can do to strengthen those. Because by having those prevention networks strong and intact, we don't have to get to those cases. And the beauty of having tools like the prenup is that I really believe that if we sign this en masse, if this is just the norm in communities, that we give gets early, that we follow what the beit din says, that we sign prenups and postnups, we really can get to a place where we're not seeing these cases. And we've seen that happen in communities on a micro level. And I really think it has the potential to happen on a macro level, but we have to care enough to get involved, and we have to harness the energy that we get from seeing aguna cases to lead us to really set the groundwork for having those prevention systems in place so that we don't have to ever see those cases again in our communities.
I do want to give a shout out to one of our partner organizations, Shalom Task Force,
Yes.
who Yoatzot Halacha work with all the time. We also work with our Yoatzot who meet with ORA. They're trained by ORA, and we're incredibly grateful for those partnerships and trying to move everything over onto the prevention part so that we strengthen Klal Yisrael. I mean, it's as simple as that. Any final thoughts from Rabbi Reese and Dr. Pelkovitz?
Look, when a couple gets married, so the husband makes certain declarations in the ksuva, and he says, "Va'ana eflach va'okir," that I'm going to serve my wife and I'm going to cherish my wife. It was a comment that was made by the Rabbi Abraham Palm Zatzal, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Torah V'das. He said that really most of the ksuva nowadays doesn't end up really being enforced. When a couple gets divorced, they don't calculate how much of the Masayim Zuz, how much of the Masayim Zukukim. The money may not come out to all that much in the end. But he said the most significant part of the ksuva are those words, ve'eflach ve'okir, that the husband is supposed to cherish his wife. And the Maharshal of Shlomo Luria, who was a great Polish rabbi, 16th century, a great posek. So he pointed out from these words that at the very least, it means a husband's not supposed to abuse his wife. He says, the chava nitna v'lo the bizayon, that she is given over to the husband as a wife to treat with honor and not with degradation. And one of the most important manifestations of that is not to hold a woman hostage when it's clear that the marriage is not working, even if it's clear that it's simply not working for her. As the Rambam writes, that we don't have the attitude that our wives are kishvuyas charev, that they are like captives of war, that they have to be kept at the mercy of their captors against their will. This is one of the most solemn, sometimes difficult obligations of a husband, that he has to let his wife go. If she wants to go from the marriage, he wasn't able to make it work. They together weren't able to make it work and make it into a functional marriage, that there is no chance anymore for shalom bayis. So one of the greatest signs of respect in terms of what a Jewish marriage stands for is to enable a wife to have the ability to exit and to have an escape hatch when the marriage is no longer functional. So it's important to emphasize, in addition to the notion that nobody should ever abuse somebody else, but this is also part of the hallmark of the Jewish marriage, part of the respect that a husband has to show towards a wife, that a wife shows towards a husband, is that we don't hold each other captive when, God forbid, things are not working out. And I always remind people that if you look at the order of the tractates of the Gemara, the tractate of Gittin that deals with the laws of divorce, it comes right before the tractate of Kiddushin that deals with the marriage. We're not into the business of seeing to it that everybody should be, divorced and everybody should be single. The purpose of why there sometimes is a need for a get is in order to free people up so that they should be able to enter into functional marriages. We want everybody to be in happy marriages. That's a part of the sacredness of our tradition of enabling people to build a bayis neman b'Yisrael.
Dr. Pelkovitz?
Yeah, just a small point going back to the question about community and the role of the community. And I was just thinking about how the nature of social media today is it pulls people to the negative. It pulls people to anger and a righteous anger. People have a hard time living in the arafel, living in the fog. And very often what I see is that in the early stages of a budding kind of aguna situation, there are all these well-meaning people who really make things worse. I don't think they mean to cause damage, but it's exactly as Kesha was saying. It takes one of the major guidelines in terms of trying to help somebody who's really in many cases the survivor of a very difficult situation, a woman who's going through this process, and robbing her of her voice, and in the name of sort of like the Boy Scout who crossed the little old lady to the other side of the street when she wants to stay on this side. What we need to do is figure out a way to be there, to be there in a way that we help people really understand that the best way to be helpful is to follow the guidance of experts like Rabbi Reese and Keshet. So I think that's an important role that we could all play in terms of community support.
we really want to thank Rabbi Reese and Dr. Pelkovitz and Keshet Star for joining us and shedding light on a tough topic. And Rabbi Reese, last week you said "Le'Yehudim hayta ora v'simcha v'sason v'yikar." We davened for the release of all of the agunot who are, and for everyone in the situation who should be moving on, and Bezrat Hashem building Batei Ne'eman in Israel.
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much.